Hello, if you're watching this video, you're on the conversation section of the Pathologies of Solitude website. We are a multidisciplinary research project based at Queen Mary at the University of London, and we're funded by the Wellcome Trust. As you probably gathered, this is a project that thinks about solitude, and this is a topic that has been very much on probably everybody's mind recently over the past, I was going to say over the past month, but really it's coming to be the past year. Um, and we're in the second COVID-19 lockdown in the UK right now. I'm talking to you from my kitchen, and I'm Akshi Singh. I'm a research fellow on this project. I'm very excited to welcome today Professor Sarah Garfinkel, who is Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience at University College London. Welcome, Sarah. We're so excited to have you here today.
Thank you. It's actually such a pleasure to be here.
So could you tell us something about your current research and what you're thinking about these days?
So I'm interested in the mechanisms of emotion, and I'm a neuroscientist, so my training is looking at the brain and how the brain might shape emotion. But I've become increasingly interested in how signals from the body may also influence how we think and how we feel. And I'm now focusing on the heart and looking at cardiac signals and also how heart signals interact with brain to shape cognition and emotion. I have just started being interested in loneliness. It's not an area that I have studied extensively at all. So I have one project actually pre-COVID where we were looking at loneliness in autistic individuals. I do a lot of work with people who are autistic or have anxiety, and I'm looking at loneliness in that context, both in relation to the heart, but also in relation to anxiety and depression.
So if you read about Sarah's work on the internet, as I've just been doing, you'll find that Sarah's interested in something called interoception. Did I say that correctly?
You did. Interoception. Yeah, it's like interoception, which is different from exteroception. So exteroception is perceiving the outside world. So they're senses that help us understand about the world. So it's smell, vision, hearing, taste, and touch. Whereas interoception is an inner sense. It's sensing internal bodily signals, such as your heartbeats. And it's looking at how individual differences in ability to sense what's happening in the body can also shape emotion and also influence instinctive decision making, memory, and other sort of cognitive based things.
So you're thinking about how we sense the insides of our bodies.
So I scan people's brains to see what happens when they are focusing on their body. I also monitor their heartbeats and look at how accurately people can sense when their heart is beating at rest. And what I find so interesting about interoception is it's uncoupled from conscious awareness or insights relative to exteroception. So I think we're made to know typically what's going on in the outside world. So we typically know if we've seen something, heard something, smelt something. Yes, of course, if things are just on the threshold, then we may not be sure, or it may just be preconscious. But typically, if we try, we're typically able to know. There's a good confidence, accuracy correspondence in exteroceptive senses. Whereas in interoception, our brains are processing all the time what's happening in our bodies, and we don't necessarily want to be distracted by our stomach signals, our cardiac signals, all of these signals which are in dynamic communication of our brain. So our brain is often processing all of these bodily signals, but below sort of conscious awareness and conscious access. And looking at how the brain processes signals, but also people's conscious capacity to tap into these signals, is something that really, really differs between individuals. So, sitting here at rest, if you were to close your eyes, then you may be able to feel your beating heart, but probably not. And if I made you do 100 star jumps, you probably would. It'd be pounding, it'd be a larger signal. So it's looking at people's capacity at rest to be accurate and then monitoring their insight. Do they know they're accurate? Do they not? And because the heart is such a beautiful organ, like it has so many lovely patterns embedded within it, it accelerates, it deaccelerates, that tapping into the signal or your brain reading the signal is an extra channel of information that guides emotion, guides cognition, guides decision making.
So what kind of information is this that we're receiving sort of under the surface, but still nevertheless tapped into?
So it depends on what I mean, it can be in regard to most things, really. So if you are waiting for something to happen, so you're at the traffic lights and you're waiting for them to change, or you're waiting for some information, then you get this lovely anticipation signal in the heart. It slows down. Um, if you are in an art gallery and looking at different pictures, there's lovely research that's been done in Switzerland by another group that shows that your aesthetic judgments correspond to what your heart is doing when you're looking at pictures in an art gallery. So the aesthetic and emotional enjoyment you can get from paintings is also signaled by this bodily signal. Intuitive decision making, so that sort of decision making where you're like, I just feel like that's the right thing, but I'm not quite sure why. That intuitive decision making can be signaled by these cardiac changes as well. So I think the heart is just beautifully reactive, and during all different types of emotional and cognitive decisions, there can be cardiac signatures attached to those.
So you've been describing this really sort of beautiful web where there's things that we're receiving from the outside world, but then there's also something perhaps a bit under the surface or maybe a bit quieter that's coming from inside us. Um, and probably all sorts of other things going on as well. So where in this web would you locate emotion?
I see. I would really say that emotion is in the body, and I get a bit embarrassed. Like I feel like these are sort of ideas that were said by William James in like 1884. So they're very old, or throwbacks are very old thoughts and historic thoughts. And I think in your world where people do capitalize on literature and history, that's maybe more traditional. In modern day neuroscience, it's a little bit embarrassing. Like I feel a little bit like the odd one out. To have, but I do really think that what differentiates emotion from cognition are these bodily signals. Like what gives emotion feeling, rather than just like cold cognitions. And I think the feeling element is really these bodily changes and the sensing of these changes. Um, so, what is fear? William James asked. And he said, your heart doesn't respond to the feeling of fear. You don't feel scared and your heart beats faster. Actually, it's the hard, fast beating of the heart, which gives rise to the sense of fear. So really, it is the sensing of these bodily changes that give emotion the emotionless of it. And I see the heart as a really central organ that helps shape how we feel.
And have do you think about how the capacity for interception comes into being? Because you've mentioned that it can exist in, um, say, in different scales or ranges, perhaps in people. And what allows us to sense our own bodies?
So I'm not so good at development. There's lovely work, I think, more from Manos Sikiris and Katerina Fotopoulou, who are maybe interested in the development of this. I think they're starting to think more along the lines of attachment and early attachment, and how interactions with the caregiver can sort of help shape interoception. Like your caregiver can help you know when you're hungry by seeing your distress as a young child and feeding you, and maybe they're an external cue to help you learn what's happening inside your body. You also get a lovely alignment of bodily signals with like parent child dyads, friend dyads, and other things, and the sensing of those can help you sort of in your relationships and connecting to others. So there seems to be there. So there is work in that area, but it's not my own. And I think that's really an interesting emerging field. Um, but there is data to suggest, again from Manos Sakiris, to suggest that it's a very early emerging process where in a lovely experiment he did with a postdoc at the time called Lara, he's now faculty, they had very, very young babies sitting on their mum's knee where they had something jump up on the screen, and it was jumping either in time with the baby's heart in real time or just out of sync. And they were able to look at whether the babies look more at the thing in sync or out of sync with their hearts, as a means to see, is there something about the way they process external cues, about whether they're in line or out of time with their heartbeats, to look at early representation of bodily signals and how that might um, interact, and maybe potentially, I think they were drawn to novelty of things outside their heart's rhythm signal. So there seems to be this early representation, and we're just getting a sense of how that manifests, what might elicit that. But this is a relatively young field. We think how much the other senses have been studied sort of for hundreds of years, whereas only in 1906 did Sheridan differentiate interoception from exteroception. So it's a relatively new sense. And research in this area is really only, I think, just starting to properly ramp up. When I first joined the field in sort of 2011, 2012, I mean, there was only a handful of us working on it, really not many people at all. And it sort of blew my mind how many people are getting interested into this topic. It's really changed.
I asked you about that just because when I was looking at your work, I found myself thinking about the way in which psychoanalysts have written about these very early relationships between infants and their caregivers, but also psychoanalysts who work with infants, and this work with infants and their caregivers together. And just the sense that one can draw from what you're saying and from these psychoanalytic examples of how even the most sort of private interior sense of the body develops in relation to someone else or a set of other people. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on what that might do to the way in which we think about aloneness or loneliness.
Oh gosh, that's an interesting question, isn't it? I hadn't really thought of that before, but I love it. I mean, I think interoception is something that can bind us together with others. So the fact that we can represent in our own physiology the signals of others, it means we can be better caregivers. We're social creatures. It can bond us together. And so I think being removed from people means that we're not able to have those sort of physiological connections in the same way with other people. I wonder how much of these subtle signals indicating bodily physiology is lost over the web. So as I look at you, I can hardly see your pupil size, but actually your pupil size is a good physiological indicator of sadness. And if we were together in person, then my pupil size would get smaller if you were sad, and I would represent your sadness in my own physiology. So you have this lovely mirroring and sharing of emotion with others, and that makes us less alone. And I wonder how much of this is lost over the internet, so you don't feel like others are able to respond to you in quite the same way, and you are thus emotionally a little detached from them. So I think that happens, and you're just very much left with your own body and your own emotions, and potentially your focus becomes more yourself when you're lonely and on your own. And what we know about anxiety and anxiety states are they're very much associated with a focus which is more on self and body monitoring, and that's very much linked to anxiety and potentially can sort of reinforce anxiety states, and how much loneliness and the focus on the body in the absence of other may contribute to increasing anxiety.
You use this fascinating but also absolutely beautiful phrase that we represent the emotions of others in our bodies. Could you just say something more about that? How does that happen?
So we know that emotions are associated with changes in the body, and that's been known for a long time. When you're scared, your heart will race. But what's also being shown is you don't just race to your own fear, that if you are watching someone else who's scared, your heart will also race with their fear. And the same with sadness. When you are sad, your pupils get small. When you look at someone else who is sad and they have small pupils, your pupils also get small. So we can change, our body changes automatically to represent in ourselves the bodily state and the emotions of the other. Actually, there's some degree of individual difference in this.
Mm.
So when you analyze data at the group level, that's what you see. If you dig into the data a bit more, then you see that some people show it more than others, and this correlates with like levels of empathy. So someone who has a lot of empathy will often change more in their body to the emotions of others. I think I try not to bring my work into my personal life because I like the separation, and but the only thing I kind of extrapolate is knowing that I want people with high empathy and kindness around me, because you know that they're feeling your emotions as well. And that for me feels a lot more safe and a lot more wonderful about what we are to be intrinsically human. It are these connections, and knowing that there are people who really feel things deeply with you, I think is a wonderful thing.
I think, I suppose we've always encountered that idea in, especially in sort of literary writing, of when people are describing being in love or just friendship. But what's so extraordinary about your work is the way in which it really goes into the granular detail of how you feel that or could be feeling that in your own body as well. And I just think that there's something kind of magical about it.
I love the fact that it echoes literature and it echoes poetry and all of these things, because actually my work is very technical. Like, we measure your cardiac signal, we measure your brain activity, we measure your pupil size. Like, it is a sort of, it's a technical science lab. So yeah, it makes me happy that, yeah, these things which are shown instinctively that you probably know more about in your world, we're able to sort of measure and emulate in the lab.
Do you ever find yourself sort of reading outside of medicine or neuroscience, like interacting with poetry or novels or?
So poetry, not so much. Novels, my mum loves literature, and she often makes me reading lists. Like, I haven't. I'm sorry, Mum, if you're watching this. I've sort of been reading too much science recently. I feel like I haven't read nearly as much as I should. But my favourite quote actually is something in Middlemarch, which is actually about how empathy can be too much, and feeling emotions can be too powerful. And it's something, if we had a keen vision and feeling of all ordinary life, it would be like hearing the grass grow and the squirrel's heartbeat, and we should die of that roar which lies on the other side of silence. And I think I love that, and it's about the sort of sensitivity to everything that's going on and how that can be overwhelming.
Can we also have empathy for emotions that perhaps are harder to deal with, perhaps harder to deal with socially, like anger or rage or some?
So in emotion research, you do tend to have this mirroring of emotions. So happy, happy, sad, sad, anger, anger. So you can have the transference of all emotions in others. You can, although we talk about empathy typically for the sort of gentler emotions, you're right, you probably can have them for the other ones as well. Anger is interesting because where you tend to get this mirroring and echoing of all the emotions where it's the same one, anger is the only one where you don't necessarily have that. So anger doesn't necessarily elicit anger. Anger can also elicit fear, because fear is because anger is a threat.
Mhm.
So with everything else, you do to some extent get this mirroring, and that one you sort of get a split that seems to be based more on personality type. So if someone is angry, then it can elicit anger in other, or it can elicit fear in other. And I did an experiment, and this is sort of going back to the sort of very sort of basic science experiments, is where I presented the word anger or the word relax very, very fast, and just below conscious awareness. I presented it in between we call it in science a mask, is where you present something, shh, and then you present the words very briefly, and then you present something else, shh, so that if you say to people, what word was that? They don't know what it was. But actually, in the body, you could see subtle changes. So when it was anger that was presented, you got very small rises in systolic blood pressure. And when it was relaxed, you got very small drops in systolic blood pressure. Okay, so you're having a bodily change to seeing this word. And then we looked at people's reaction time. So after they see this word anger or relax, we saw whether they got faster or slower to make a decision. And in those individuals who were more prone to anger, they had high trait anger, they were faster to respond to something after they saw the word uh, anger or just below conscious awareness. Whereas those individuals who were less angry, who were more likely to have a fear response, were slower to make a decision after they preconsciously saw the word anger. And this, I think, is coupled to the fact that not everyone has the same reaction to anger. Some people who are angry, and that's more like we call it an approach, it's a motivational reaction, whereas a fear response is a withdrawal, more like a freezing, a slower reaction. So you get these different responses in people. So if one were to extrapolate that up into empathy, then their anger is complicated, the simple mirroring is less likely to be seen.
That's just fascinating, but also um, you're talking about the different responses to anger. It makes me think about something that we think about on this project, and that we've sort of really been struck by over the 2 years that we've been researching solitude, which is that people experience solitude in really, really varied ways. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that, um, about solitude as the state that evokes such a range of responses, and often such opposed responses.
That's a brilliant question. I don't know, so probably you can tell me much more about that. My work just looks at subjective levels of loneliness. So I
Mhm.
think while you're looking at solitude in general, and actually lockdown gives you a great chance to look at that cross sectionally in many people. My work is actually just ask people, how lonely do you feel? And it's really about the subjective perceptions of loneliness. And then what my research says is that that subjective perception of loneliness is very, very tightly linked to depression symptoms and anxiety symptoms. Um, and normally clinical data is very messy, whereas this was much more like a straight line. So when loneliness increases, anxiety and depression was also increased. And to see something that's such a tight correlation in clinical data tells me there's something deeply entwined about the states of anxiety and depression with loneliness. Potentially feeling lonely can lead to anxiety and depression, or being depressed and anxious is a deeply lonely state where you're removed from others. So it's not necessarily being caused about the direction, but it's saying there's something about both of those states which are very similar in some ways.
Could you tell us a bit more about the study?
So it was done pre-lockdown, and it was done in individuals who also have a diagnosis of autism. So one of the things that I'm really interested in trying to understand is autistic spectrum conditions, um, and how they're potentially really misunderstood by the public. And I think there's a sort of idea that autistic individuals may enjoy solitude and may like being on their own. And that may be true for some, but actually, loneliness is 4 times higher in autistic individuals relative to the general population. And those were data that was collected prior to COVID and lockdown. But 4 times higher is so high. And that's really telling you something about the condition is potentially misunderstood. And actually, autistic individuals may really want these social connections. They may just find them hard. They may not quite know how to go about them. They may be scared to to seek them in case they're not reciprocated or in case they don't quite know how to navigate them. But the longing is there for the connection, and the loneliness is real. And we know it's loneliness, not just solitude, because my very brilliant postdoc, Lisa Quat, didn't just ask people how lonely they were. She also asked, and how distressed does this make you? So looking at the sort of sadness part of it rather than just the solitude part of it. And she found that reports of being lonely and distressed about being lonely were basically perfectly correlated in autistic individuals. So it wasn't just that they enjoyed the solitude, they felt the solitude deeply as a sense of sadness.
Why you said that something about this was misunderstood in the popular understanding of autism. Why do you think so? Like, what's been going on?
Yeah, I don't know what led to it. I think there were also false rumors that individuals who were autistic lacked empathy, and that's not true either. That if you monitor the bodily response of an autistic person, if they watch someone else in pain, they actually have a higher bodily empathy response than someone else. They actually feel it more deeply, the pain of others. So I think assumptions are made without really understanding, and better understanding of this condition will also mean that hopefully we're more able to see the complexities of neurotypical and neurodivergent individuals and not make assumptions based on how we might think they are based on how they seem, like maybe they're presenting in a different way, and trying to understand more deeply and more carefully how others are feeling, and the signals they're trying to give off to say how they're feeling just may be a little different, or they may not quite understand in the same way, but that doesn't mean they don't have the deep feelings themselves. Or they may have the deep feelings themselves but not quite know how to communicate them, but it doesn't mean they're not having them. And I think it really tells us that we need to, or everyone needs to be more sensitive and understanding to the complexities and differences of others to try and really understand. Yeah, I don't know. There wasn't the sort of the most scientific answer, but that's sort of how I see it.
No, thank you so much. And I think I've just been so struck in talking to you that not only about the connections between your work and ideas in literature and poetry and perhaps what is privileged in those domains, but I've also just been thinking about the way in which you think about the body and center it and pay attention to it also has this connection with feminist thought and feminism and just this project of saying that the body is important and again just how much it brings into view when you do that, and the possible sort of wide-ranging implications it may have for conditions like autism that, as you say, are so misunderstood. So yeah, so just a huge thank you from me, but I'm sure from people listening, because there's just something so radical about the work that you're doing. Um,
Well, it's really, I mean, a lot of the stuff they're so kind. A lot of the stuff I've cited has been work of other people as well. Like I'm part of a really exciting research community And it's an exciting time to work together and try and investigate this. And I have amazing people in my lab, and I've cited experiments of people around the world, and we're all sort of coming together to really try and use experiments to find out how signals from the body can shape the way we think and feel for others as well.